Chandu the Magician is something really very, very unique, and people have forgotten it. I think they're going to really have a nice, eye-opening delight when they see it.
Chandu the Magician still stands up today as one of the great fun pulp movies, simply because it looks so good.
It has one of those early, wonderfully over-the-top villain performances by Bela Lugosi. I mean, this is Bela Lugosi at his prime. This is Dracula, Murders in the Rue Morgue, White Zombie Bela Lugosi. And he's pretty unleashed in it, and he looks great. And he really plays it for all it's worth, and it's a lot of fun.
Chandu the Magician was made in the early 1930s by Fox Studios. It was based on a children's radio show that went out on a West Coast radio station in the early 1930s.
It was very popular in America in the 30s. Gain Whitman played Chandu and several other characters.
Radio was enormously popular, and it's hard for people today to grasp. Radio was really kind of a household thing by about 1926 and kept growing, so that by 1930 it was a national sensation.
We've forgotten radio as an adventure action pulp type medium now, but quite a lot of major heavy hitting franchises came from radio.
It was a medium that just got people to use their imagination, so that everyone who listened to a radio show had a different picture in their mind of the action and the characters and the villains.
Interesting phenomenon is that there were other mystic superheroes on radio, and also in the comics, by the way, at the same time. Two that I can think of are the Shadow, who could cloud men's minds through hypnotism, and Mandrake the Magician, who, like Chandu, was a magician.
The Green Llama was another show. He was a mystical guy. Chandu was a mystical guy. You had a lot of people around like that. And those shows became hits immediately. And they actually were more popular with most fans than your regular nighttime shows.
These became so popular that I think the film companies saw a good thing, and it was like something that was a pre-sold entity.
Well, what's the matter? Don't you recognize me?
Oh, Frank!
The debut of Chandu as a radio show was in 1931, and it caught on very quickly, especially among kids.
Chandu was created to be kind of a detective character rather than a superhero, although he had a turban and I'm sure if he had to get into a fight he could handle it, but mostly he did the deductive stuff and other people did the biffing.
Chandu is a yogi, an American who's gone to India, studied the Hindu religion, and mastered magic to the point where he can cloud men's minds through hypnotism and cause them to see things that aren't there and, you know, just generally have his way with them.
The idea of a, Caucasian from the Western culture going to India and learning these skills and becoming a yogi was something that was in the public consciousness in the 1920s and 30s. There was a real idea that there was something to be found in the other cultures at this time. For example, the Hollywood stars like Tallulah Bankhead were friends with the various swamis and people who came to Hollywood. And in fact, Hollywood itself was known for allowing a lot of different kinds of religious practices and mystics and seers and occultists and so forth. So this was, very timely project.
In 1931, Universal, of course, had tremendous hits with Dracula and Frankenstein. Now, those were the first, not the first sound horror films, but the first supernatural sound horror films. Because before that, producers felt that American audiences would not accept the supernatural on film, unless it was a broad fantasy, say like The Thief of Baghdad or something like that. But they did. They accepted Dracula and Frankenstein in large numbers, and Paramount, of course, made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which had that supernatural element. So the time was ripe for 20th Century Fox to jump in and make their supernatural film.
Every studio in Hollywood was saying, if Universal could have huge hits like Frankenstein and Dracula, I think we better look, around. And the Fox Film Corporation looked around at the radio, and Chandu was very popular. They grabbed onto the coattails of the radio show and started using that as publicity, and then developed a script based on that character.
The interesting thing about Chandu the Magician was it was directed in the serial style of having two directors handling different elements of the film. So you had William Cameron Menzies, the great art director and set designer, and then the French director Marcel Varnel, who is better known for the films he made in England with Arthur Askey and Will Hay and people like that. And I believe that they split the chores pretty equally, with Cameron Menzies dealing with the action and the big set pieces, and Varnel working with the actors on the smaller material.
You think I'm foolish, don't you?
No, dear. Just very, very young.
Marcel Varnel's background was in comedy, so of course the scenes in Chandu that have to do with Herbert Munden and his mini-me character really were trademarks of Varnel's work, not of William Cameron Menzies, not of the Chandu serial on the radio.
One of the more amusing and memorable images for the film is when Miggles opens a cabinet and the mini Miggles emerges from behind a row of bottles.
Miggles, aren't you ashamed of ourselves? Every time you drink that liquor, you're not yourself.
Somehow finding the little Miggles behind the bottles in the cabinet struck my funny bone.
I'll never touch another.
In order to get this movie made so efficiently, and because this magician had to perform a lot of elaborate feats, special effects were called for. So you had to have an elaborate film that would be impressive visually, that could be made quickly. They called for William Cameron Menzies.
William Cameron Menzies had been a designer for Fox Film and other studios all through the 20s. And he really made so many films work because he storyboarded them and also designed the sets and gave them a very specific kind of look that it really set them apart from any other designer at any other studio. He was a brilliant man.
William Cameron Menzies was the first great art director of American film. He made his reputation in the silent days with, very art directory movies like Thief of Baghdad and The Bat and Son of the Sheik. His look was not naturalistic. It was very stylized and it was very recognizable. The cognoscenta, people who were interested in film at the time, knew his name, knew what his sets looked like.
The year before, he had co-directed a movie called The Spider. The main character was a stage magician who gets involved in a murder. That character was played by Edmund Lowe, who was under contract at Fox. Looking back, no doubt the Fox executives said, well, Edmund Lowe played a magician in The Spider. He'd be a good bet to play Chandu the Magician. William Cameron Menzies handled those special effects for the magical illusions well in that film. Let's have him do the same thing for this one. We'll give him another co-director, but we'll depend on him for the visuals. They even had the same two screenwriters who had adapted the play for The Spider to adapt the radio show for Chandu.
It wasn't chance, Maggie. It was fate. I mean, it was fate that brought me in front of that door.
They cast one of their contract players, Edmund Lowe, in the role of Dr. Frank Chandler. Unfortunately, Lowe is not the most dynamic actor in the world.
Edmund Lowe, in many of his other films, was rather charming, even charismatic, but not in this kind of a situation.
Where they really scored with the film was by casting Bela Lugosi only a year or so after Dracula. And it's Lugosi who really makes the film memorable. It's one of those rare cases where it is the villain who totally overshadows everything else in the film.
Lugosi in Chandu, really, apart from the visual niceties of it, I think, is the whole centre of the picture, because it's a very juicy role for him to play.
Civilization and all its works shall be destroyed. Men shall return to savagery. Only one supreme intelligence. Me.
They say your story's only as good as the villain, and without him, perhaps, the film wouldn't hold together quite so well.
Edmund Lowe doesn't have a chance against him as the hero. It's one movie where the hero can't compete with the villain, from the point of view of his looks, his dramatic power, his sex appeal, anything. Lugosi just eats it all up, and as a result, because it's Bela Lugosi who's gobbling up the movie like this, I think it tends to somewhat be considered a horror film because Lugosi's always considered horror.
Lugosi's at his peak here, really. He is lean and trim physically. He has the intensity and power that he was capable of giving. He's a megalomaniac who really acts and looks like a megalomaniac. When he describes how he's going to destroy London, leave it a mass of rubble, it is something that Bela Lugosi / Roxor wraps his voice around.
They shall bow before me in worship. Axor, the god, whose hand deals death.
He doesn't just relish doing it, he relishes speaking about doing it.
My very favorite scene in Chandu, the magician, has to be the end with Lugosi being frozen and can't move, and all this stuff zapping and blowing up all around him, and he's had it now. And the expression on his face, this terrified expression, knowing he wants to do something and he can't. That was my favorite scene, because I wasn't expecting that in the film, to be honest with you. I thought maybe he's just going to get shot, or maybe even just captured. I wasn't sure.
One of the challenges that Menzies faced with Chandu the Magician was to provide an elaborate and impressive set of visuals quickly, with ingenuity, so that it could look expensive and look like it took a long time to make without actually having to spend a long time on it.
He had an artistic ability which came through very strongly in films like Things to Come and Chandu, although very few people know of Chandu.
I'm not exactly sure how he did this because cameras weren't small in those days, but he goes through the entrance and he goes down these corridors and he makes left turns and right turns. And this is all from the point of view of the camera. He's just showing us the lair of Roxor, and there's no actors in the scene. You could do a shot like that now with CGI, and it would fit into any fantasy movie. Obviously, he didn't have CGI. He was working with models and cameras and lights and real stuff, which makes it, in my opinion, doubly impressive.
I think he had the setup. You want each design to be relatively simple. So his concept was to design an arena within which actors would move around and not make a very big thing about the detail of those sets, which is quite interesting. All of his work as an art director, you can see that style put into practice.
Are you ready to tell me the secret of the death ray? No. You still may change your mind.
Although Fox had great plans for the Chandu character, the film did not turn out to be a huge success for them at the time, probably due to the fact that its hero was not the most charismatic actor in the world, and as a result their option lapsed in the character.
While the film did not necessarily do spectacular business in cities, it did, according to Variety, do extremely well in small towns, in the areas between the large cities. And more matinee business than evening business, perhaps naturally because of its appeal to children.
However, Sol Lesser, who was a distributor of a lot of Fox product, decided that he would like to make a sequel, and 2 years later produced The Return of Chandu as a 12-part serial. Deciding not to use Edmund Lowe again, he went to the one person he knew was still a box office name, Bela Lugosi, and decided to recast him in the role of the hero. It's a fun serial. There's a lot of cliffhanger endings and things like that. It's always surprised me that nobody's ever decided to revive the Chandu character and make more films with him.
It's not like almost any other horror fantasy film done at the time. It's very unique, and nobody else really kind of followed in those footsteps. It's similar in spirit to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Indiana Jones movies. They're much closer to Chandu the Magician than most of the horror films that followed in the 1930s.
It's its own genre, sort of. It's not really a horror film, and it's not really a serial, but it has the qualities of both.
The movie is very much a fairy tale. It's like a great-grandfather of the Harry Potter movies, more so than a horror film. This was a very different, very unique, and very charming anomaly, really, in horror film history.